Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt ZAUN. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. I have never heard someone say networking is not important, because we recognize as a culture the sheer importance of networking and what it can do in our lives. My challenge to everyone listening to this episode is, are you doing anything about sharpening your skill set when it comes to networking? I'm excited for this conversation because that is what we're going to go over. My guest and I, we talk about the disconnect between social media and actual shaking hands networking. We also talk about the process of networking, different things that can set you up for success when it comes to creating a process, as well as how to keep your energy level up when it comes to networking. So I'm so excited for you to hear this conversation. The guest is not a stranger to the show. It is Terence Farrell. He has been on numerous times now. We've unpacked all kinds of elements of his life and what he's done for his community. I will include all of the different episodes that we've gone through in the show notes, episodes like stories of leadership, how to get involved in politics, how to change your community, and how hobbies make you more creative. This episode, we're going to expand the idea of how to have intentionality and more strategy when it comes to networking. For those of you who are not familiar with Terence Farrell, Terence served as a Chester County Commissioner for 12 years. And before that, he was the Recorder of Deeds for 8 years. Today, he is the president of For Real Solutions, a consulting firm that brings value to its clients through leveraging Terence's knowledge, experience, network, and creativity. Two of the major focuses for his business are reducing healthcare costs for various organizations and mitigating loss in pension funds that occur because of fraud or other illegal activities. This episode, we are going to tackle how Terence was able to do what he has done through networking. Enjoy. Terence, welcome back.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks again for having me.
I really appreciate your time, and I learn a lot from our conversations. And I want to dive into another topic today that we haven't really gone through on networking. And I want to talk about the strategy of networking, how you leverage networking to get to where you are. And this is going to be an extension of other episodes that we had done before. We did Stories of Leadership, where we really kind of went through different elements of your life, and then how to get involved in politics and how to change your community. And a lot of that ties back into what you've done networking wise. So where I want to start this conversation is there's been a major shift culturally to social media. And for anyone that has listened to this podcast, you know, I've done numerous episodes on how people can intentionally and strategically utilize social media. So I'm not knocking social media. My business has very much positively benefited from utilizing social media. And I know that a lot more people can take a hold of social media and get it to work for them. But I feel like there's been a disconnect when it comes to likes on a screen versus actually networking with human beings, shaking hands, building the connection. And I feel like it's being lost. I don't know if it's a generational thing or what we've done culturally speaking in society to kind of have that fray, but I want to gear a conversation in that way, that a lot of people are missing the importance of networking because of what social media has done. And again, there's a big difference between getting a bunch of likes versus actually shaking a bunch of hands and having conversations. So when I say networking, what is the first thing that comes to your mind, Terence? Let's paint the scene for people. When I say networking, where does your mind go to?
Well, first of all, I appreciate that perspective about social media. And there may be a disconnect between people liking and, in-person meetings and in-person networking, but properly utilize social media, and there's a ton of platforms. You have to pick your own favorite, but social media can uh, be a form of networking. You use it beneficially as a form, going beyond just the likes. It can also be used to reinforce in-person meetings, and I use it in that capacity. But traditionally, what networking, at least for me as a recovering politician, has meant is that it was a series of going to events, whether they were um, governmentally based or nonprofit based or politically based, or for whatever reason. Maybe they're just going over to a friend's house for a barbecue and meeting people in person, having a conversation with them, being able to discern pretty quickly where some synergies might be, how I might be able to help that person, or how that person could help me. Part of the whole strategy of networking, of course, is to be able to follow up with somebody. So, when I think of networking, there's a whole process from meeting a person, having a conversation that is at least somewhat meaningful to that person, so they do recall me, finding out how I can follow up with them. Traditionally it's was getting a business card or finding a phone number, but nowadays I can just ask, for example, are you on LinkedIn? And that's sufficient for me to be able to follow up and to get all the other information I need. So networking, to answer your question specifically, at least traditionally has meant meeting people in person, connecting, sharing information about how to follow up, and then following up.
I like how your mind went right to the process of networking. You mentioned not only the meeting, but the follow up. So obviously there's an intentionality behind that with networking. Now, does this go through your mind before you enter a room? If we're going to talk about in-person networking, so I want you to imagine, you're at the door walking into, whether it's a conference or walking into a ballroom, you're about ready to shake hands with people. Is there an idea of this is what I want to accomplish when the night is over? Like, is that in your mind, or have you built out such a systematic approach that it's almost instinctual at this point?
Well, it's both instinctual and intentional. So I've gone over the process so many times, meeting people, making sure I get the information, making sure perhaps I tell a joke or something that's memorable, so that they realize and remember who I am. But it's also intentional. When I'm going to a particular event, I'm going through my mind, and particularly when I was in governmental office, I often got a list of who was going to be at an event before the event, so I could go through it and say, "Oh, I need to talk to Darius about this, or I need to talk to Sean about this, or Emily about this." And if I see them, then that will be top of mind. So I prepared, 4 or 5 names, but when I go into a room, sometimes I'll pause at the beginning of the room. Somebody will greet me, maybe we'll have a brief conversation, and then they'll leave. And I'll look around the room to see who's there and who I might want to engage in conversation with. So there's that intentionality, but there's also this the intentionality of having the conversation. And sometimes the person is wanting to talk to me for a reason, and that provides a basis for reciprocity, for me being able to do something for that person before I'm asking for them to do something for me. So engaging and encouraging them, incentivizing them to really follow up with me and to form that bond. So it's both instinctual and intentional in my networking at this point.
Let's expand out that research perspective. Are there specific things that you're focused on research wise? Is it where they went to school and a little bit about their background, so you can build that rapport? Or what like, if you were to list off maybe 3 of the top things you look for in that research, what would they be?
Well, I think the goal, as you mentioned, is to build rapport, and the rapport can be anything that I note in the research. There's so much available on the internet, in social media, and I'll usually do a lot of research, particularly if I'm going into a room with some people I don't know particularly. If I'm going into a room with an elected official, say, or a group of elected officials, I will have looked at their profiles on their governmental webpage. Maybe I looked at what they've done on LinkedIn. Maybe I even looked at Facebook. And really, what I'm looking for, Matt, is a connection. It it doesn't have to be a specific question or a specific topic, but something that resonates in terms of what I'm doing. Um, so I will look to whether they're, playing music, whether they're into sports, whether they've got a particular thing that they mention, like they're into holistic health or vegetarianism, something that I can make a comment on. And I've got enough background in enough different areas that all I really need is one or two topics to engage in conversation with, and then from that point, things flow naturally.
All right, so I like what you just said, flow naturally, and I want to speak to that because I got in trouble years ago with the mentality I had regarding networking. So I'm a big research guy. I'm into a lot more data points than less data points. I don't think anyone would probably argue that point, right? It's good to have a lot more information than less. But what I did was I built up so much research that when I went into a meeting, I had an agenda. And when the agenda didn't go my way, when the conversation didn't go the way that I wanted, I got a little bit flustered. Maybe not, maybe the person that I was with didn't see the frustration, but internally I'm thinking like, this isn't going the direction I want. This isn't good, right? Because I did all this research. So it wasn't until I shifted my focus towards curiosity versus having that agenda. So what do I mean by this? So, I'd be doing research and I saw that, hey, they went to this school, they were raised in this area, they follow this sports team. So surely they check these boxes. So when I have a conversation, here's what's going to come out. And it wasn't going in with that curiosity. And then I was able to kind of shift and focus on, all right, I know a little bit about this person, but I'm still going to be curious to kind of see where that conversation flows. So I like that you said flows naturally. So if a conversation isn't going your way, meaning like you're not connecting in the way that you want, what do you do? Do you just put on your listening hat? What do you do when you might be a little bit frustrated where an evening of networking is going?
So yeah, it's more like some kind of racket sport, whether it's tennis or nowadays pickleball. It's a back and forth, and it's finding out what interests them, and then responding to that interest. I think I'm a Renaissance man in the fact that I can talk about a lot of different subjects, but ultimately, there has to be some sort of connection for me to continue talking to somebody, particularly when I'm in a room full of other people's. So it might be that the conversation's flowing, it's back and forth. I'm seeing where we might be able to work together. I'm seeing, where we might be able to get together down the line and form some alliance. But it also might be that, hey, I spent a couple of minutes talking to this person, and I really need to move on. So how am I going to get out of this conversation and move on, rather than being trapped? Because at a networking event, at some kind of event, time is limited. You're only going to have a certain amount of time, and you want to get to maybe that one person in the room that you need to connect with. And it's not necessarily numbers, it's really quality of the connection. So I'm not looking to connect with everybody in the room. And I'm usually going in with the mindset that this will be a successful evening if I connect with that one person who I resonate with and who I can help and who can help me.
All right, so let's dive in even further. So everyone listening, I just want you to recognize the importance of this. just and here's one of the main reasons why I wanted to have Terrence on to talk about this specific topic is over my career, I have worked with and seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of politicians in action. I have yet to find a politician that has been able to work a room like Terrence Farrell. And I mean that sincerely. And I mean that in a very positive way. Like, you really know almost like the rules of engagement when it comes to networking in a big, big way regarding that work the room piece. So I want to talk about the different dynamics. So I want people to view this almost like a sports type game where, like, let's look at football, right? You have rules of engagement, you have a certain time, there's different distractions that could be happening during the game, there's strategy, there's intentionality, there's different plays, all these different factors. And I don't think enough people view networking in this way. Okay, so I've never read a business book in my entire life that says networking is not important. Every single business book talks about the sheer importance of networking. So I always want to challenge people. What are you doing with that importance? How are you actually making your networking better? That goes back to people like yourself, Terrence, that are masters at networking. So you had mentioned what happens when you get stuck in a certain conversation. Well, clearly there are decision makers in a room that you want to get to. So I want people to picture this. All right, so picture you're in a room. Let's say there's 200 people in the room, and Terrence, you've identified 3 key decision makers in this room that you need to talk to. There's 2 hours. Like if we're going to look at like a sports analogy, right? There's a certain amount of time. So there's 2 hours for this networking event. How do you make sure that you're having those conversations with those 3 decision makers in that time? Because there's going to be other people that are going to come up to you and they're going to bombard you and they're going to try to have conversations. What's going through your head to get to those decision makers?
Well, first of all, one of the things that you need to bring to the room, need to bring to the event, need to bring to the football game when you come to the football game is energy. You need to have a high level of energy. You can't be dragging, or you're not going to do your best. If you are dragging, you're going to want to come, ready to meet people, energized, ready to have conversations that are a high energy level. And that's the first thing. So to be able to work a room, and I have worked a room, going from table to table or person to person, you've got to have the energy, and people will feel it if you're going through the motions rather than sincerely asking them about what they want to do. But as I mentioned, sometimes when I first come into a room, I will scan the room looking for who's there. At the registration table, if there are name badges out, and I'm early, which I try to be, I like to see on the name badges laid out on the table who's there and who I want to be in touch with. But then as I go into the room, I'll scan the room before I engage in a conversation, because there's one way to really turn someone off, and that is if you're talking to them and looking over their shoulder or looking past them for that next most important or more important person to talk to than that. People see that right away. They feel that, and that's, you just might as well turn away and leave right away rather than try and make believe that you're actually interested in talking to that person. So, if there's 3 key people, sometimes I'm not able to reach them all. But, if I can reach the one person, and, the networking does not necessarily end when that event ends. So often, if I want to talk to somebody, it might just be an in passing kind of conversation where, that person's going toward the food, I'm going toward the beer. And I just say, hey, John, I'd like to give you a call later on. Are you around later this day or later in the week? And that person will acknowledge that. So, I don't have to have that conversation there. I can, follow up with a phone call, follow up with an email. But I try to get to those people I want to talk to there. But once again, decisions really aren't made, in that networking room, particularly if I'm asking for a contract or need to explain something more deeply, I'm looking to set that as a platform or a springboard to either get together with that person later, maybe for lunch, maybe just at the office, maybe doing something else, or have a phone call, a Zoom call, followed by email. So it's not necessarily that everything's going to take place there. And usually, if I'm going into the room, I've met most of these people before. They know me, I know them. There may be some people I want to know and want to know better. Sometimes that's just happenstance that I, have a conversation with someone who's virtually a stranger, and we find out that we have something in common and want to strengthen that, by a follow up call, conversation, in person meeting, lunch, dinner, whatever. So I don't necessarily get to all three. I have a list in mind. Sometimes the circumstances of the conversations take me in other directions. But if I can just have a couple brief words just to alert the person or the persons that I want to engage with more fully, then I can follow up.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm sure that this has probably happened as well, is you're not even able to get to that person, but it still gives you a reason to shoot them an email and say something like, "Hey, John, I really wanted to talk to you. Unfortunately, we weren't able to connect, but could we meet for coffee on Thursday?" Right? It's less
Exactly.
weird than emailing someone saying, "Hey, I thought of you. Can we get together?" Right? So there is a little bit of a strategy with that as well. But I did want to touch on the energy piece. So for people listening, just so you can understand just how draining someone like a Terence's calendar used to be, going from event to event to event. I mean, you told me once about your calendar a couple of years ago, and it's nauseating. Like, how in the world can one human being keep up? What do you do with potentially being emotionally drained based on just the amount of events you're going to still keeping that energy level up?
That's a really good question. Now, when I was a county commissioner for Chester County, I did have staff to help me with a lot of the aspects. I had somebody who would schedule. I had somebody that would change my schedule if there was a conflict that came up. I had someone who would write or help write speeches for the governmental piece of it, so I wasn't spending time and energy doing that. Um, and going from event to event, in the days when people actually went to events before COVID, I would use the time in my car to prep myself mentally, prep myself, with speaking points, etc., so that when I actually got to the event, I wasn't spending time, working through what I needed to say, etc. That had already been prepped out. Um, Getting uh, charged up for events, or just staying in a state where I could go to, not only the governmental, but the evening events, the weekend events. It was really a holistic approach. I tried to get to the gym a couple times a week. I tried to exercise. I tried to eat well, tried to get my sleep, and sometimes there were late nights and early mornings, but I had flexible time where I could just take some downtime in the afternoon. So I was cognizant of my energy level, and also forecast what kind of energy I would need toward the end of the week and where I might get breaks, where I could get exercise, which always charged me. So once again, it was a holistic approach to trying to maintain those energy levels. It wasn't just, going to the event and trying to get up to another energy level in order to be able to meet people.
Well, that says a lot, because as far as the eating right and the exercise, because I will never forget, it was either 2010 or 2011. I was in a room with you. Okay. So there was a ton of people at this one event, and it had to have been past midnight. And you were still there shaking hands, having conversations with people. And I literally remember looking at you thinking, like, is this the Energizer Bunny? Like, you must have been up at an ungodly hour in the morning, event to event to event to event. Now it's past midnight and you're still shaking hands. So it speaks to just the self-care that you allowed as far as energy with exercise and nutrition, just so you can maintain that energy level. So I want to shift gears, and I want to talk about potential bad experiences. Okay. And I think this is good for anyone to hear, not only politically speaking, but also business wise too. There's a lot of people that are going to listen to this podcast where they run teams. So they're running teams, and not every experience is a positive experience. There had to have been times where you're at an event, someone comes up to you, they might say something nasty, they might have real pushback with you, something that might really fluster you, maybe even something that tears into your character, so to speak. How do you go from that event to the next event and not skip a beat? What do you do mentally to get through that piece?
Well, if you've been in politics for a while and been successful, you have to have somewhat of a thick skin. I mean, not everybody likes you, and not everybody expresses their like for you. But mostly when somebody comes up to you and they have an opinion, maybe it's about something you did that they don't agree with. I think the best thing to do is to listen, and not necessarily push back and explain your position, but to present yourself as understanding where they're coming from. It was surprising how often when people either called the office or I met them, in person, or they sent an email. My mantra was always to respond. If someone called the office with a complaint, I didn't hide behind my phone. I would, my assistant would give me a number. I would call them, and just the act of listening, just the act of responding, at least to say that I hear you. I might disagree with you, and then you mentioned going from event to event. I don't know. Sometimes it gets under your skin, but for the most part, you just cannot let negative comment, negative energy drag you down. I mean, if you're on a mission and you want to get accomplish some goals, whether it's long term or short term, you got to keep focused on what your purpose is.
That's a really good point. And I think a lot of people need to hear that, because we really take different things with us that can have a major effect on the next person we're talking with, right? Especially if we just got chewed out or someone said something negative, and now we got to keep going and keep going. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So
And
let's
Matt,
go.
it's that responding to or putting out negativity is really should be focused on social media also. I'm very rarely commenting on Facebook or telling people, even third party, that I don't agree with somebody. I try not to put out negative energy on social media so that it doesn't come back to me.
That's something that a lot of people need to hear, because that stuff stays with us. Stays with
Exactly.
us in a big way. So I want people to think bigger about this. So we're talking about your background, obviously politically, but there's a lot people can gain networking wise in the business world and in the nonprofit world. So it really transcends different industries for sure. So if someone's out there and they're trying to grow their business, they're doing networking, or maybe they serve on a board of a nonprofit and they want to go into different events to really carry out that mission, where would someone start the process of getting better at networking?
Well, as they say, it's not practice that makes perfect. It's perfect practice that makes perfect. So the more you do it, the better you get. When I always thought that I got to be a better communicator, a better speaker, because I was speaking every day. But one thing I want to underscore is the fact that to get good at networking, to get good pretty much at anything like that, you have to spend some reflective time also, not just going to the event, meeting some person, jotting down their phone number and everything, but actually spending some time during your day to reflect upon whom you've met, um, reflect upon what they said. And it's in those quiet times that you might see various connections that you didn't see right away. And so I'd spend some time every day trying to think about whom I've met, who could connect me to somebody I want to meet, who I could connect somebody to. So, the networking, at least a critical part of it, takes place in your mind. And to get better at it, you reflect upon what you said, what you could say better next time, and then go to the next event. The more you do it, the better you will get.
Yeah, and that reflective time really ties into to good follow-up. It amazes me in business how many people don't properly follow up. I can't tell you how many times I'm talking to someone that it's really a sales process. This person's trying to sell me on something. It's an incredible presentation. I love the product or service they're selling. I want to buy. My wife and I are in agreement with it, and they don't follow up. And it's just lost. So I think the reflective time really goes back to how are you going to keep in touch with the person? Because Terrence, you could have an incredible conversation with someone at an event, and there could be some synergy on they want to work with whatever deal or whatever is happening. But if there's no follow-up, that is not going to happen. So do you have anything to say regarding having really good, solid follow-up?
Well, if I can, and time's always a limitation, whether it's that evening or the next day, I'll send them a little note. First of all, just, great to talk to you at the chamber event. And I'm looking forward to receiving your information about your product. So that sort of touchstone or ping to them will remind them. I also reach out to people for if I see an article in the paper that maybe mentions them getting an award or their company, I'll use that as a touchstone to reach out to that person. I follow people on Facebook, and I usually send a note on their birthdays. 90% of those people will just say thank you, but one person, or the 10 out of the 100, will respond, what are you doing? I was thinking about you, and maybe we should get together for coffee. So just any sort of touch point, that can keep your network alive and warm is good. And, your follow up can remind someone of their follow up. And if you were really interested, in their product, it might be you that actually follows up, not through not through pride that you would say, well, they should be in touch with me, but through just generosity of spirit that you would say, hey, this person is probably really busy. Let me remind them that they were going to get something to me.
Sure. I like you mentioning the cards. I've actually received some of those cards, so thank you. But think about it from a monetary perspective. Like everyone talks about, oh, the price of stamps keeps going up. Well, it's a really low cost when you think of the ripple effects it can have, meaning just the scenario you said about 100 cards being sent out. That is not that big of a cost to stay in touch with people. And so few people are getting that type of personal card in their mailbox that it really stands out. So, I mean, I remember when you did that quite often. And I thought it was really impressive that you were able to connect with people in that way. So for everyone screaming, oh, it's so hard to get above the noise when it comes to social media and all these different marketing and advertising avenues, a really good place to look that I think is very much underutilized is people's mailboxes. So thanks for mentioning that.
No, you're exactly right. And thank you for mentioning it, because in this day and age, people are eager to send an email, a text message. But when you get a handwritten note in the mail, or even a typed letter in the mail, but a handwritten note is the gold standard. You remember that person, and you're thankful for them. And there's so little competition nowadays for getting a real personal kind of note in the mail. I just recently sent a check to a friend of mine who's running for reelection in another county, but I also included a handwritten note to say how much this person meant to me and why I was contributing. So hopefully that'll stick around for a while and elevate our friendship above the noise. So yeah,
Sure.
if you want to do something, and I know a politician, and you probably know him also, who made the habit of, after they saw someone during the day, spent the time in the evening writing a little note to them that they would collect and send out right before an election. So they would recall that they met at the post office and had a conversation about the Philadelphia Phillies, and then they would send it out, as if maybe 6 months later, but recalling that conversation, and it was handwritten, and it was very effective. This person won when other similar politicians lost. I will not undervalue the force of a handwritten note.
Power of the pen.
The
Power of the
power of
pen.
the pen.
For sure. Well,
Pen
thank
is
you.
mightier than the swordfish.
Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. Well, so thank you for this conversation, Terrence. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you talking about different elements of strategy and intentionality with networking. There are three different things that are my biggest takeaways. I really appreciate you mentioning that social media could be used to reinforce networking with people in person. I don't think a lot of people view social media that way. I think that's a really good way to view social media, that as we're putting content into the world, as we're at a networking event, people are going to go look up our profile, look up whether it's on LinkedIn or Facebook or wherever we are, and they're going to see the different things we put out there. It's more name ID, it reinforces. I appreciate you mentioning that. I also appreciate that you have a process in place for networking. You mentioned beforehand the research, then the meeting, and then the follow-up. And those three components are really, really important. And then I also appreciate you mentioning the energy piece, the energy coming into the meeting, but also the energy after, which is that reflection time on here's who I met, here's where the energy was, here's where I need to follow up. So I think those three components were so incredibly important in this conversation. So thank you for that. Now, if people want to get more information on what you do or they want to reach out to you, where's the best place they can go to get that information?
Well, they can go to my LinkedIn profile, and hopefully you'll drop a link to that profile in the comments for your podcast. That's probably the best way. They can get an email address from there, and we can start a conversation if that's what they want to do.
Perfect. I will include that in the show notes. People could just click and go to your LinkedIn profile from there. So thanks again, Terrence. I very much appreciate this conversation.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's always great to be on your podcast, and I get insights from when you sum up what I've said. So I appreciate your summing up what I've said.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.